Making the Future 2012 by Noam Chomsky is a collection of essays that reflects on global political developments from 2007 to 2011. In this work, Chomsky continues his sharp critique of U.S. foreign policy, corporate power, and neoliberalism, while also addressing environmental crises, global economic inequality, and the erosion of democracy. Through these essays, Chomsky not only dissects the nature of power in the modern world, but also emphasizes the importance of grassroots activism and social movements in making a better future. A recurring theme in Making the Future is Chomsky's critique of U.S. imperialism and its global consequences. He argues that the United States, under the guise of promoting democracy and fighting terrorism, has consistently acted to maintain its hegemony. Chomsky examines U.S. military interventions in the Middle East and Central Asia, pointing out that these actions are primarily motivated by the need to control strategic resources like oil and to assert dominance over rival powers. Chomsky points to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as prime examples of how U.S. interventions have destabilized regions and caused widespread suffering. He argues that these wars were based on false pretenses, such as the claims of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or the goal of eradicating terrorism in Afghanistan. In reality, these military campaigns have led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and have created the conditions for further conflict and extremism in the region. Chomsky highlights the contradictions in U.S. foreign policy while promoting itself as a champion of freedom and human rights. The U.S. supports oppressive regimes and violates international law when it serves its interests. Moreover, Chomsky critiques the U.S. government's broader role in maintaining global inequalities, particularly through institutions like the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank. These institutions, according to Chomsky, impose neoliberal policies, such as austerity measures, privatization, and deregulation, that disproportionately harm developing countries, while benefiting multinational corporations and wealthy elites. Chomsky devotes a significant portion of Making the Future to analyzing the 2008 financial crisis and the underlying forces of neoliberalism that caused it. He argues that the crisis was the inevitable result of decades of deregulation, financial speculation, and policies that favored the wealthy at the expense of the broader population. Chomsky contends that the U.S. government, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, allowed corporate and financial interests to shape economic policy, leading to unsustainable levels of debt, inequality, and instability. One of Chomsky's main arguments is that the financial crisis exposed the deep flaws in neoliberalism, the economic ideology that promotes free markets, limited government intervention, and privatization. Neoliberal policies, according to Chomsky, prioritize profits over people, leading to the erosion of social safety nets, the weakening of labor rights, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. While millions of people lost their homes and jobs during the financial crisis, the government bailed out the financial institutions responsible for the collapse, further entrenching inequality. Chomsky also critiques the response to the financial crisis, particularly the austerity measures imposed by governments around the world. He argues that these measures, which involve cutting public spending on education, healthcare, and social services, disproportionately harm the poor and working class, instead of addressing the root causes of the crisis. Chomsky asserts, austerity policies exacerbate inequality and undermine democratic governance. In Making the Future, Chomsky also addresses the urgent issue of climate change and environmental degradation. He argues that the global capitalist system, driven by the pursuit of profit and growth, is incompatible with the long-term sustainability of the planet. Chomsky points to the destructive practices of fossil fuel companies, deforestation, and industrial agriculture as major contributors to environmental crises, including global warming, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Chomsky is highly critical of both governments and corporations for their failure to take meaningful action on climate change. He argues that the political and economic elites are more interested in protecting their short-term profits than in addressing the existential threat posed by climate change. Despite overwhelming scientific consensus on the need to reduce carbon emissions, powerful interests continue to block efforts to transition to renewable energy sources and to reduce consumption of fossil fuels. Chomsky also highlights the role of the media in downplaying the severity of the climate crisis. He argues that corporate-controlled media outlets often ignore or distort the realities of climate change, preventing the public from fully understanding the urgency of the situation. This in turn limits the political pressure on governments and corporations to take action. Another key theme in Making the Future is Chomsky's concern about the erosion of democracy, particularly in the United States. He argues that the political system is increasingly controlled by a small group of wealthy elites and corporations, who use their money and influence to shape policy in their favor. This concentration of power, Chomsky warns, undermines the democratic process and disenfranchises ordinary citizens. Chomsky points to the role of money in politics, particularly in the form of corporate lobbying and campaign contributions, as a major factor in the decline of democracy. He argues that politicians are more accountable to their wealthy donors than to their constituents, leading to policies that prioritize corporate interests over the needs of the public. This is evident in areas such as healthcare, where Chomsky criticizes the U.S. government's refusal to implement a universal healthcare system. Despite widespread public support, Chomsky also critiques the media's role in perpetuating the decline of democracy. He argues that mainstream media outlets, which are owned by large corporations, tend to promote the interests of the wealthy elite, while marginalizing dissenting voices. As a result, the public is often misinformed or uninformed about critical issues, making it difficult to hold those in power accountable. Chomsky examines the impact of the war on terror on civil liberties, both in the United States and globally. He argues that the U.S. government's response to the 9/11 attacks has led to the erosion of fundamental rights and freedoms, particularly through policies such as mass surveillance, indefinite detention, and torture. The USA Patriot Act, for example, has given the government unprecedented powers to monitor and detain individuals without due process, which Chomsky views as a dangerous encroachment on civil liberties. Chomsky also critiques the global implications of the war on terror, particularly the use of drone strikes and other forms of targeted assassination. He argues that these actions, which often result in civilian casualties, violate international law and fuel anti-American sentiment around the world, rather than making the world safer. Chomsky contends the war on terror has led to the spread of extremism and violence. Despite the grim analysis of the state of the world, Chomsky expresses hope for the future by highlighting the potential for global resistance and grassroots activism. He points to movements such as Occupy Wall Street, protests against austerity measures in Europe, and environmental activism as examples of how ordinary people can challenge the power of elites and push for social change. Chomsky argues that meaningful change will not come from the top down, but from the bottom up, through the collective efforts of individuals and communities working together to resist injustice and build a more just and sustainable world. He emphasizes the importance of solidarity and international cooperation in confronting the challenges posed by corporate power, environmental destruction, and global inequality.